Laura's farm was in a remote region, surrounded by vast fields and a dense forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. Laura had inherited her parents' farm, and despite the loneliness of the place, she found peace and comfort in rural life. However, on that dark autumn night, the peace she knew was about to be shattered. Laura was a young farmer with dark hair and determined eyes. Her family used to live on the farm with her, but that weekend, they had left to visit relatives in the city, leaving her alone in the quiet vastness of the property. It was a cold night, with a pale moon that cast a dim light over the landscape. Laura was busy taking care of the animals before going to bed. With each step he took toward the barn, his footsteps echoed on the ground, which was still damp from the afternoon rain. The animals on the farm seemed restless, agitated, in a way Laura had never seen before. The cows bleated nervously, the horses neighed anxiously, and even the chickens clucked strangely. It was as if the animals felt something that Laura couldn't perceive. As Laura finished her chores in the barn, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She looked around, but nothing was out of place. Everything seemed normal, except for the fact that the atmosphere was filled with a strange tension. Upon returning to the farmhouse, Laura turned on the lanterns to illuminate the darkness that enveloped the place. The moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the stars seemed distant and dim that night. The farm, which used to be a welcoming haven, now seemed shrouded in unsettling shadow. The sounds of the night were eerily silent. There were no crickets chirping, no owls howling in the distance. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something Laura couldn't understand. Laura knew she had a lot of work to do before going to bed. She needed to feed the animals, lock all the doors and windows, and make sure everything was in order. But the feeling of restlessness that accompanied her prevented her from concentrating on her tasks. Minutes turned into hours as Laura wandered the farm, checking every nook and cranny. She turned on the lights in every room of the house, trying to dispel the darkness that seemed to infiltrate her soul. The wind whispered through the trees surrounding the farm, creating an eerie soundtrack to the night. Laura felt increasingly isolated and vulnerable in that vast void. She knew she was alone on the farm, but the feeling that something or someone was watching her continued to torment her. Despite the disturbing sensation that enveloped her, Laura tried to calm down. She was determined to keep the farm in order and not let her fears control her. However, the events of that night would only intensify. With all the farm chores finally completed, Laura retired to the farmhouse. She locked all the doors and windows, but the oppressive silence and uneasy feeling followed her into the house. The farmhouse was old and full of stories, with its weathered wooden walls and rustic furniture. Laura built a fire in the living room, hoping the heat and light would chase away the darkness that seemed to tighten around her. Sitting in front of the fireplace, Laura tried to distract herself with a book, but her mind was constantly focused on the strange sounds coming from outside the house. They were like indistinct whispers, murmurs that seemed to get closer and closer. The feeling of uneasiness grew when Laura heard a sound coming from the top floor of the house. It was a low, almost inaudible sound, like a distant whisper. She placed the book carefully and went up the stairs, her heart beating wildly. Upstairs, Laura came across a door that was ajar. She would have sworn she had locked it before going downstairs to take care of the animals, but now it was open, revealing the darkness that lurked in the room. Laura slowly pushed the door open and peeked inside. The room was empty, but something was wrong. The window was open, and a cold, biting breeze swept through the room, making the curtains slowly sway. She quickly closed the window and locked it. It didn't make sense for the window to be open, as it was closed when he went up to make tea. The feeling that something was wrong never left her. Laura double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. She tried to convince herself that she was just nervous about being alone on the farm, but the feeling that something sinister was approaching wouldn't leave her. Back in the living room, Laura decided to make a cup of tea to calm her nerves. As the water boiled, she thought about calling her family, but remembered that the farm was out of cell phone range. While waiting for the tea to be ready, Laura felt something watching her again. She looked around the room, but nothing seemed out of place. Only the fireplace cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere on that dark night. The sounds of the night remained eerily silent. There were no more crickets chirping, no more owls howling in the distance. It was as if nature itself was hiding, as if it was afraid of something. The feeling that something was approaching intensified when Laura heard a sound coming from the kitchen. It was as if dishes were being moved or cutlery falling to the floor. She stood up slowly, cup of tea in her hands, her heart pounding in her chest. Laura walked towards the kitchen door, trying not to make any noise. When she opened the door, what she saw left her speechless. All the cupboards were open, and plates, cutlery, and pans were scattered across the floor. There was no one in sight, but something had caused chaos in the kitchen. With a shaking hand, Laura took a knife from the kitchen drawer and prepared to face the stranger. The farm, which used to be her refuge, had now become a place of nightmares, and Laura was determined to find out what was happening. With knife in hand, Laura moved cautiously through the kitchen, her eyes alert for any movement or sound. She tried to keep her breathing controlled, but the fear that enveloped her was about to swallow her whole. The strange sounds persisted, echoing through the kitchen, but there was no one in sight. Laura approached the kitchen window, looking outside in hopes of finding an explanation for what was happening. The night was darker than ever, and the forest around the farm seemed inscrutable. Laura closed the window and locked it, still holding the knife tightly. She knew she couldn't just ignore the inexplicable events that were happening. Something was clearly wrong that night. As she walked away from the window, Laura heard a noise coming from the living room. It was as if something was moving among the furniture, an invisible presence that she couldn't see. She turned toward the sound, her mind filled with growing terror. Laura moved carefully toward the living room, her eyes scanning every dark corner for any sign of an intruder. But what she saw stopped her in her tracks. The furniture in the room was moving on its own, sliding across the wooden floor as if it had a life of its own. The coffee table slowly rotated, the chairs moved toward the wall, and the pictures on the walls hung in a haphazard manner. It was as if an invisible force was causing this chaos. Laura swallowed hard, unable to understand what was happening. She tried to convince herself that there was a logical explanation, but the feeling that something supernatural was present was undeniable. In an act of courage, Laura moved towards the moving furniture and tried to stop them. But his hands passed straight through the chairs and tables, as if they were made of smoke. She was completely powerless in the face of the invisible force that was acting there. It was then that Laura heard a distant whisper, a faint but ominous sound. It was like a voice whispering unintelligible words, echoing through the room. Laura knew it couldn't be a person's voice, because there was no one there but her. The living room was immersed in an ominous atmosphere, and Laura felt like she was on the verge of a terrible discovery. She had no choice but to face the invisible presence that surrounded her, even if it led to a terrifying confrontation in the shadows. With the feeling that something sinister was lurking, Laura moved determinedly towards the unintelligible whispers that filled the living room. Her knife was still in her hand, although she wasn't sure she could use it against an invisible threat. The whispers intensified as Laura approached an armchair that was slowly rocking, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. She swallowed hard, her voice shaking as she asked, "Who's there? What do you want?" There was no response, but the chair stopped rocking abruptly. The whispers now seemed to be directly in front of her, but the darkness prevented Laura from seeing anything. It was then that a dark shadow began to take shape before his eyes. It was like a human figure, but distorted and sinister, with empty eyes that stared at Laura. The figure rose from the invisible armchair, its presence icy and threatening. Laura was frozen in fear as the figure approached her. His face was hidden in the shadows, and she couldn't make out any specific features. The only thing she knew was that it wasn't human. With a tremendous effort, Laura raised the knife and pointed it toward the figure, her voice shaky but firm. "Stay away from me. I'm not afraid of you." The shadowy figure let out a muffled, disturbing laugh. She approached Laura, her steps slow and awkward. Laura backed away, stumbling and falling to the ground, but kept the knife in a defensive position. The figure was now almost upon her, its icy presence hanging in the air. Laura could feel her heart hammering in her chest, and fear was overwhelming her. With the last reserve of courage, she thrust the knife towards the figure. The blade passed straight through the figure, as if it were made of smoke, and the dark presence disappeared into the shadows. Laura was alone in the living room, terror still surrounding her. She remained on the ground for a moment, trying to catch her breath and understand what had happened. The living room was silent, and the furniture had returned to its original place. Everything seemed normal, except for the fact that Laura knew she wasn't alone on the farm. She slowly stood up and picked up the knife from the floor, still shaking with fear. The farm, which used to be a place of peace and tranquility, was now a place of nightmares. Laura had no explanation for what had happened, but she knew she could no longer stay there. Deciding to escape that haunted place, Laura grabbed some clothes and essential items and left the farmhouse. The night was cold and dark, but she could no longer bear the sinister presence that haunted her. Laura never returned to the farm and could never understand what happened that terrible night. The farm remained abandoned, a haunted place that was avoided by everyone in the region. Laura's story became a local legend, a tale of terror that echoed in the dark, silent nights of that remote region.